Hey you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome back to the Summer Shorts series where we are getting the nerdy details on specific subjects all summer long while we gear up for season 3 of the podcast. And today, I have a good one with Troy Hinke, who works as a consultant at Living Roots Compost Tea down in Nashville. And I got Troy on the phone to get the skinny on the components of a good compost tea and how plants utilize them and much more. Troy is great, and it's a great conversation that I literally could not have. Would not be able to do it without the support of the Patreon members at patreon.com/farmerjesse. Your contributions there have a direct effect on our ability to produce content. That includes the podcast, that includes videos, that includes the website, that includes everything. And these summer shorts. So check that out at patreon.com/farmerjesse. And at a certain level, you even get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Weaving Roots Farm, Adam Hensley, Bob and Ann Patton, Clara Coleman, C-Mac Small, Dan Brisebois, David Williams, Eric Posh, Eric Schlellner, Esoterra Culinary, Fiona and Donnie Firefly Farm, Grant Timms, Jacob Arthur, Jared Kirst, Jay Armour, Jay McCombs, Jean-Martin Fortier, John Mills, Kevin Keane, Liam Miller, Marc-Andre Giroux, Michael Madden, Mike Garcia, Patricia Jones, Ryan Gosser, Seeds and Soil Farm, Steve Larson, Tim Baldwin, Wild Mountain Seeds, Yannick LaPlante, and one more big thank you to Jen Lawrence of Witt Stable Farm, who sent us thank you notes for doing the podcast. Jen, you're awesome. All right, enough from me. Let's get into it with Troy Hinke of Living Roots Compost Tea.
Cool. Okay, so I have two main questions and then probably 1.5 million follow-up questions. But the first question that I'd really like to get into with you, Troy, is what are the components of a good, healthy compost tea?
The main components are going to be starting off with quality water. So most of the water that we have that we're going to be using is going to be coming out of a tap, which most likely is going to have chlorine or chloramine in it. So chlorine and chloramine is meant to kill bacteria in the pipes so that we don't drink that and get any type of sickness. And we're trying to enhance bacteria and microbial growth in water. So we want to try and get rid of the chlorine either through off-gassing, which you can fill your brewer ahead of time and let it sit out for a couple days for like 48 hours to off-gas any chlorine or chloramine, or you can turn a air pump and bubble it and off-gas it that way in a matter of 12 to 24 hours. Otherwise, you can use rainwater or other types of water, but it starts with the water quality. And then, of course, you need quality compost or vermicompost. I like to use a mix of the two. We want a good diversity of microorganisms in the mix there. And also, if, I've got a microscope, most people don't have a microscope, but we want to make sure that all the soil food web characters are present in the compost. So bacteria, fungi, protozoa, which are going to be flagellates, and amoeba, and then nematodes. So quality compost, quality water, and then the different types of food I add. Foods for microbes are humic acid. I like to also use fish hydrolysate. Fish hydrolysate is different from fish emulsion in that fish hydrolysate's it's basically taking a fish and putting it in a blender and blending it up. Emulsion is when they remove the fats and oils from a fish so they can sell it cheaper that way, but you want fish hydrolysate. And then I also like to use kelp if I can, or I might use feather meal. So I always use humic acid, and I usually use fish hydrolysate, and then I mix it up between either kelp or feather meal. Feather meal, I don't use a lot of foods in my mix, but it's got more nitrogen, so I usually use feather meal in the spring, and then I'll use a kelp in the middle and latter part of the season. Otherwise, there are a few other types of foods that you can use for microorganisms. Those are ones that I stick with. There's been some debate in the past few years about using unsulfured blackstrap molasses. Elaine's always talked about using unsulfured blackstrap molasses, but if you're not using a microscope to see what types of bacteria are reproducing in your tea, then it's possible that you could have some type of detrimental bacteria in there that you're getting to reproduce to high numbers that you wouldn't want to be spraying out on anything that you're eating, or it might be detrimental to plants. So, and normally, unsulfured blackstrap molasses is a bacterial food, and normally we have a good amount of bacteria anyway in the tea brew that we don't need to promote more bacterial growth. And some of these other foods that I'm using, like the fish hydrolysate or kelp, is going to help to feed that bacteria and help it to reproduce anyway. So I don't normally worry about adding any unsulfured blackstrap molasses, but that's pretty much all I can think of for starting materials for a good compost tea.
Okay, so within that, you were talking about water, and I have kind of a follow-up question there. Are there filters that work or that you recommend?
I've read they have those inline filters that you can hook up to your hose for removing chlorine for gardeners and things like that. And from the reviews, I'm just simply going off the reviews that I've seen on Amazon and whatnot. The people who have used those, they've tested their water beforehand. They've used one and they've tested it afterwards, and they just don't seem to be worth the money to spend on that type of filter. If you were going to be brewing constantly, if you had a business that, day after day you're making and brewing compost tea, it might be worthwhile to purchase a filter. At my scale, it's easy for me to just let it sit out or off gas. The other thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about that is if you don't have time to off gas your chlorine or chloramine, do not have a chemistry background, so I'm not able to explain how this works. But humic acid can tie up chlorine and chloramine in waters. And as I was saying, I don't have a chemistry background, so I'm not able to explain how that happens. But there's something about the ions in chlorine that humic acid binds to and makes it so that it's not going to have any effect on bacteria. And then it degrades. The chlorine or chloramine will basically kind of degrade over time once you spray it out over the land. So the humic acid will tie that up. And normally I'm reliant on, if I don't have time to off-gas chlorine or chloramine in my brews, then I'm reliant on the humic acid binding that up. And I use enough humic acid in there. It hardly takes any. It just takes a few drops in like a 55-gallon brew, or however much you're using. So that's what I normally do, is use humic acid to tie up the chlorine.
Well, with the humic acid, are you buying that in, or is that something you're making on your in your production?
It's possible to make it. I think there's a video on YouTube. Elaine and I, when we were at Rodale together, sat down one night and made a jar full of humic acid, and it took us a couple hours to get like a 64-ounce jug filled up, so it's extremely time consuming. Most of the humic acid that you're going to find is made from leonardite, and leonardite is not exactly the most sustainable source, but it's kind of one of those things that I'm stuck with. Like, I can't find any other source of humic acid. And even lately, in the past year, the demand for humic acid has really gone up, where it's hard to find. I'm normally trying to buy like 5-gallon quantities of it, and it's hard to find any at a reasonable price or in large quantities. So,
okay, right. So it's getting a little bit harder to find, but it's also something that's not that easy to make yourself. Are there? I guess there's probably not really distinct alternatives for that.
No, and in a natural setting, you would get humic acid and fulvic acid are two of the main acids that are in soils. Humic acid is the one you're going to find more of, and then fulvic acid, and there's a third one that I can never remember the name of. You can make humic acid by taking like tiny little reusable tea bags and putting your own compost in them, and dripping water through it at an extremely slow rate. So that's why it took us so long to fill that 64-gallon jug, because we're putting the water at like a, drip, 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 just slowly leaking it down through to extract the humic acid out of the compost and get it into our own container. So in like retail sales, I'm not sure where other people, other than Leonardite, I'm not sure another source of like what it comes from, what you would purchase it in the form of, you know what I mean?
You talked about bacterial food, like not using the molasses, but what about fungal foods? Are you using anything to kind of increase fungal populations, or does that make sense?
Right. So all those foods, I didn't mention that ahead of time, but those foods, so Elaine has found through her research in the past 35, 40 years, that all the foods that I've listed, like humic acid, fish hydrolysate, kelp, and feather meal, are all going to be foods for fungi.
Okay.
And it's been my experience that in brewing, you normally, and I talked to Trad Cotter about this too, of Mushroom Mountain. I see him different times and asking questions, and I was asking him, like when we talk about tillage and tillage breaking up fungal hyphae in the soil, like it doesn't make sense to me that having an agitated water would allow fungi to grow. And it's been my experience that you don't really get much fungal growth in a tea. It's like after effect, once you put those foods in there with fungi and spray it out onto the soil or plant surfaces, that then it's going to have that food to take off and germinate and grow more hyphae from that.
Right, that makes sense.
So I think when people are viewing something in the microscope and then they might be kind of looking at a brew over time, it's just, I don't know if it's necessarily that the fungi is growing more as much as it is that the agitation of the water is extracting more fungi into the water, which is what we're trying to do altogether. Is compost tea, what works in the compost tea, and I think that's going to be your next question, is like the microorganisms and the life in the compost tea. And what we're trying to do is extract all those microorganisms that are on the surfaces, or as much as we can that are on the surfaces of the compost and organic matter, into the water. You
mentioned, I'm going to stick on this for one more second, the negative bacteria, like I'm assuming like E. coli and those sorts of things.
Right.
Does the agitation in the brewing process itself have an impact on the populations of those sort of pathogenic organisms?
Yes, so that's the whole reason that we aerate and use an air pump in compost tea, is because we want to keep the water above 6 parts per million, the oxygen level in the water above 6 parts per million, so that we're keeping it aerobic, because all of these microorganisms that I'm referring to, and the beneficial ones that work with plants, are going to be aerobic microorganisms. So when you're using foods, that's why you want to keep foods to a minimum. So like I normally am brewing very large quantities, but just say a 5-gallon brew. In 5 gallons of water, I'm going to use, like 3 to 5 cups of compost, and then I'll use a tablespoon of humic acid and a tablespoon of fish hydrolysate and a tablespoon of another food. I mean, it's very minimum. So if you use too much foods, or there's a lot of factors that play into this. It all depends on oxygen levels and temperature outside and how much food you've used. But if you were to use, too much molasses, which happens a lot. I see different YouTube videos where people are just using way too much. You're going to, even if you do have the brew aerated, the bacteria are going to eat that. So what happens is they eat the food, reproduce, and they're getting up to high levels. And they get to such a high level that they've used up all the food and used up all the oxygen that they can. And that's when a brew starts to go anaerobic. And it's kind of like a graph where you get a slow climb, and then all of a sudden there's a quick descent from getting a peak population of beneficial aerobic microorganisms to hitting a point where it's starting to go anaerobic. And then once it starts to go anaerobic, it goes downhill really fast. And so once you hit that point, if you have started to breed some Spirillum or E. coli, then it could really start to take off, even though you do have air on it.
Interesting. I didn't realize that you could have an anaerobic agitated tea.
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Okay, so second part of the question, or second part of the things that I want to ask you. Talk a little bit about how plants actually utilize the microorganisms when they're sprayed on. Like, how do they actually utilize the tea?
You've had Elaine on before, and I can't remember how much of a background she gave into soil food web stuff, but it's basically a symbiotic relationship between plants and microorganisms. And for eons, before humans were ever on planet Earth, plants and microorganisms have had this symbiotic relationship where through photosynthesis, plants are making and storing energy within themselves, and then they are putting some of that energy in the form of carbon and carbohydrates, sugars, proteins out through their roots. And it depends on who you ask, and it depends on the plants. There's all kinds of different figures, but anywhere from like 30 to 70% of the carbon energy that's made in a plant is sent out through the roots in the form of root exudates to feed microorganisms in the soil. So a plant knows how to manage its own needs and knows what nutrients and minerals it needs, and it will send out signals through these foods into the soil to attract bacteria or fungi that are going to meet its needs. So, it might say, I'm low in magnesium right now, so it's sending out foods that are going to attract different microorganisms in the soil that are going to bring those specific things into the root zone. So it's a matter of the bacteria and fungi being present there in the root zone, and then they have eaten organic matter in the soil and stored excess nutrients and minerals in their body, and then through predator-prey relationships, something comes along and eats them, and when it poops it out, it releases it in a plant-soluble form, so then the plant's taking that up. And through having all those microbes in the root zone, you're getting constant nutrient cycling from the microorganisms to help feed the plant and provide all that it needs. So when you're spraying compost tea out, like I said, it's all about the life in the compost and compost tea and the living microorganisms in there. That's what you really need to think about. And then you're spraying that, and as you apply a foliar spray, it's giving a coating to the plant that's kind of like a sheath that's going to provide a protective surface of beneficial organisms that if, there's all kinds of bacteria and fungi in the wind that are blowing around, like in the late summer, that's how you get your blight on tomatoes. It's coming in through the air. So this is providing a protective surface that will keep disease, microorganisms, and pests at bay. And then also in the soil, so that's a foliar covering. And then in the soil, it's been like, it works exactly I've been describing, where, you're applying these microorganisms to the soil to help the plant to help get life into a soil that may have lost life through compaction or chemical use or tillage. So like in conventional agriculture, people use all of those means: large tractors, tillage, and constant chemical use. And basically they're kind of making the soil sterile to where plants become chemical dependent. You feed it a synthetic fertilizer and you've killed all the life out in the root zone there for it to be able to take up any other type of nutrients except for that synthetic fertilizer. And now the plant is dependent on fertilizer, and that's how people get hooked on chemicals and chemical sales and make a lot of money. So it's all a matter of getting life back into the soil and maintaining that life through cover crops and mulches and things.
So are you making different foliar sprays versus soil sprays, or are they kind of interchangeable?
So some people will aim at having recipes for, just a turf or for a orchard or something like that. because of when I'm normally going out to spray, I do, my tagline is landscapes, lawns, gardens, and farms. So I'm normally going out and spraying a variety of types of plants, like from turf to flowers to bushes to trees. And so I'm kind of making an all-around mix. That's a whole, it's kind of a whole nother discussion, but basically if you look at a chart of succession, where if you were to take a little plot of land and remove all the vegetation from it and then let it go and go for 20, 30 years to where it starts off, you've got pioneer weeds, and then you've got some grasses growing up, and then the next year you're going to have some, or in a couple of years, you're going to have shrubs, and then it'll eventually have a coniferous and deciduous forest. So as you go from the beginning stages of succession, that's bacterial dominant soil where it's pretty much all bacteria, to like the middle of succession where we've got row crops or tall grasses. That's going to be equal bacterial to fungal ratio in the soil. And then as you move into coniferous deciduous forest systems, it's going to be completely fungal dominant soil where you've got the same amount of bacteria, but you've just got way more fungi. So in that sense, when you're trying to make a brew, if I were to spray just a turf, like if I were to go get hired by a golf course, I'd be spraying all turf, and I'd want to be making more of a bacterial dominant compost tea. But with most plants and with most systems, we've lost fungi in the soil. So I'm always trying to get more fungi going. So that's why I mainly use these fungal foods, is because many of the soils that I'm working with, like I do lawn and landscape sprays in the Nashville area here, and Nashville is booming right now, where we've got a lot of new house builds, and so people have stripped the topsoil away. We've got clay soil then that's been completely compacted by running a bunch of machinery around there while they're building the house, and I'm trying to get beneficial fungi back into those soils and systems to help them get back to a more what they would be in a natural setting, undisturbed. So hope that answers your question. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I missed to answer your question. Does that bring up any other questions for you?
I've been hearing more and more that perhaps plants do absorb some of the microbes into their cell walls, like they're actually sort of consuming them. Does that play in at all in terms of like adding foliar sprays that we're aware of, I guess? That's a whole different
level. I wish I knew a bit more about that, because you are correct in that when people take a leaf sample of different types of plant and look at the cells throughout it, a lot of those cells do contain fungi that are growing into the plant. And so, yes, I'm hoping that some of the microorganisms that are contained in the compost or compost teas are going to also be microorganisms that are going to work with a plant on the inside as well as outside. There's so much knowledge that we still don't have, like, about a lot of these different types of stuff that still needs to be learned. So, yeah, that's one of the things I think that people are studying more in the recent years.
Yeah, I think that stuff is really interesting, and it gives us a different perspective on how plants use organisms, so thus how we need to use microorganisms.
Right. Can I say one thing real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
You just referred to our human body. So one of the big things lately is our microbiome and the human microbiome. So we have bacteria and fungi in our gut that when we eat food, I think that they say like 80% of our body or 85% of our body is made up of microorganisms. So it's not just us, it's a whole billions of beings. But when we consume food and drink, bacteria and fungi in our system, especially our stomach and intestines, are what are breaking that food down and making those nutrients available for us. So we are a small microcosm of the whole natural system, and that we work in the same way as, like the forest. So that's the same way that when a leaf or stick falls in the forest, fungi grows up from the soil, grabs onto it, and bacteria are breaking down those that organic matter to make those nutrients available to the plants in the surrounding system. So it's kind of a neat little analogy there that we're all one when you come down to think about it, and work all the same way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's no differentiating between, like, I was reading a book recently and they were talking about how they don't like it when people call the soil alive. They like it when they call the soil an ecosystem. And I kind of took issue with that because I'm like, well, I mean, a cow is an ecosystem, a human is an ecosystem. I mean, but we still consider those things to be alive. So I think that the soil still fits into that. It's semantics, but I think it's important.
Right. Yeah, I like to think of it as an ecosystem. I think that's a better way. I think it forces people to think about it in a different way, because that's one thing I talk about in one of my Living Soils talk is we need to be providing habitat and food. So like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the top two of the top three are food and shelter. So in the soil, like when you've got this, like Tennessee, I'm not sure how Kentucky is, but a lot of the samples I look at are really clay heavy. And so we need to be getting organic matter back into those soils to provide food and habitat for these microorganisms, because that's what the soils are lacking a lot of. So yes, it's an ecosystem. It's a living ecosystem. So,
right.
Yeah, I think that would.
Right. It's like humans though too, right? Like if we don't eat fiber, then our, the microorganisms that we need in our system don't stay in there either. Like it's that I think there's, I think it's for me, I feel comfortable anthropomorphizing that just only because, because it's kind of the same thing. Like it needs food and it releases gases, and it needs a constant,
right.
It needs to be fed regularly, and not overfed or underfed. And yeah, I mean, but I think that's great.
Right. And in that same sense, instead of feeding the plants, we need to be feeding the soil. So, I really into pushing cover crops, like to keep this life maintained in the soil, we need to be using cover cropping or intercropping when there's a cash crop in the ground, so that we're keeping the entire soil pumped full of carbon, feeding those soil microorganisms and keeping them alive. So in the same sense that you're talking about us eating fiber to feed the microorganisms, we're trying to feed the soil.
Well, Troy, I appreciate so much your time.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
All right, if you enjoyed that interview, make sure to follow Troy on Instagram and all the places at Living Roots Compost Tea. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're getting it, rate and review it. Huge thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help. Enormous thank you, as always, to my wife, Hannah Crabtree, for all her help behind the scenes. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.